Beginning in the 1970s, and particularly the later 1970s, the UFO abduction phenomenon just seems to explode, where you have people telling the most incredible, fantastic, unbelievable stories of being taken aboard UFOs by humanoid beings and subjected to tests. There are some cases claiming sexual contact between humans and humanoids. Some cases of people claiming they were taken even to other worlds in spaceships. These stories are just fantastically unbelievable. Many of them, though not all of them, are elicited through hypnosis, which has its own problems. But there are also people making conscious claims.
The abduction phenomenon was with us from the beginning, but nobody realized it. It took us about from 1947 to 1961, about 14 years to discover the abduction phenomenon.
These people are different from the contactees. They're not marginal types with a long history of occultism. Most of them don't have any history of confidence crime. They're just normal people. In fact, they pretty much have the profile of other kinds of UFO witnesses to less extraordinary manifestations of the phenomenon.
Well, the first case, the Villas-Boas case in Brazil, was not really widely known in the United States. I mean, the Barney Hill case was the one that got the front page, so to speak, here. But the Villas-Boas case was reported in England first, in depth. And it was fascinating because the man went out on a tractor and was more or less paralyzed. And the creatures came, took him into the craft, and the basic thing is that there was some kind of sexual act which involved him in what seems to be a half alien, half human female figure. His attitude towards the figure was that she made sort of animal-like noises, and but wasn't too unusual looking. I think he said she had red hair, as I remember. But one of the things is that before they had sex, something was put over his body, some liquid or mist or something, which made him throw up. And I always thought that one detail tended to add a lot of veracity, because if you're making up some sort of wild sexual encounter inside a UFO, you're not going to bring in the part that you vomited. That's not going to be. It's not going to make it more pleasant. Well, I think right now it fits the patterns that we've been looking at for a long time. It was when people in the United States, researchers, heard about it, they didn't like it because of the sexual component, the reproductive component. She ostensibly pointed to her belly and then pointed up to the sky, implying that she was going to be carrying his baby. And that was, of course, obviously kind of an upsetting thing for people to have to deal with, because it was so tabloid-ish. But yet, as the thing went on and began finding out more and more about the abduction phenomenon, that became central, this reproductive part, not necessarily the sexual part, but the fact that reproduction is the goal. It's hard to know much about this case, but one of the things is the fact that he was evidently considered by the investigators a very solid citizen, and he went on to become a lawyer, actually, and I think he's now dead. But there was never any sense that he was inventing this, and he seemed to have been pretty terrified by the whole thing.
People were having very odd experiences early on, which we could not possibly interpret or recognize. It wasn't until 1961, here in the United States, when the Barney and Betty Hill case took place, that people began to understand that people were claiming that they were being abducted. At least these people were. Barney and Betty Hill were not like the contactees of the 1950s. They were not charlatans. They weren't trying to make a buck off the deal. They were not people who were prone to telling tall tales and that sort of thing. And consequently, they were taken much more seriously than all the rest of the contactees put together. But one story does not a phenomenon make. And what you're looking for, of course, is patterns. And with Barney and Betty Hill, we didn't quite know how to approach it, how to study it, how to understand what was happening. However, after Barney and Betty Hill, there was a sporadic group of UFO reports of abduction reports that came through from time to time. Still, nothing that was looking like a pattern other than the fact that people were being abducted and examined.
The basic thing about that case was, of course, it was the first one we had ever really heard about. It wasn't necessarily the first case. And as I got involved in these cases, looking into them years later, I ran into two that occurred in the 1920s, many that happened in the 1930s and 40s. So it was far from being the first. It was simply the first that we heard about. My history of all this was that I had a sighting in 1964, which is just a sighting. When I read about the Hill case 2 years later, in 66, I just thought it was ridiculous. I couldn't accept it. I could go up to as far as what I had experienced. That was okay. Something flying around that I could observe in the daylight. But an abduction, I thought, just can't accept it. But the more I read about it, the more I began to think I had no real reason to reject this account. These people seemed to have gotten themselves in a great deal of personal trouble by even bringing it up. Actually, they didn't want the story out. And the really interesting thing about it was, of course, that everyone assumed, since this happened on a lonely road in the White Mountains, that this was just a case of two people who were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, so that it could be seen as an extremely rare event. But in actual fact, of course, there's a lot of reason to believe Betty had had a number of experiences before this happened, and Barney's behavior suggests, although I never knew him, that he had had earlier experiences too. But what's crucial about that case is how many facets of the later reports that we've gotten left, right, and the center came out of that case before we had a chance to even think about it. First, the whole issue of missing time from that case, where they could not recall between point A and point B what happened. The second thing, of course, were the examination on a table and the idea of a reproductive procedure where a needle was put in her navel. They told her it was some sort of pregnancy test, but at least the word pregnancy gets into that. And a sperm sample was definitely taken from Barney Hill, even though that was not mentioned in the book because it was seen as unseemly. And interestingly, once laparoscopy was developed, we began using the navel as a place of entry medically to see what was going on in the ovaries and so on. But at the time this happened, doctors were saying, a needle in the navel has nothing to do with anything. And of course, the fact that hypnosis, for the first time that we're aware of, was used in that case, administered by a skeptic who didn't like what was happening as the stories emerged. And so there were so many kind of basic issues there that just kept being repeated again and again and again. So in a way, it's really extraordinarily important for the fact that it laid down the terms, although they didn't know that at the time, for what the shape the phenomenon was about to take.
Eventually, the cases began to build up more and more and more and more until they demanded attention. Right. The evidence for them could not be dismissed as the ravings of lunatics. We had to finally figure out a way to investigate these on some sort of level that had depth. This was a very difficult thing to do. What gave us, of course, the entree was hypnosis, and hypnosis was used with the Barney and Betty Hill case. Now, Benjamin Simon, who was a very famous hypnotist at the time, really didn't know how to do hypnosis with abductees, obviously, since nobody did, and didn't know what questions to ask, and didn't know how to interpret the answers. So that's where we actually had to do the most of our learning, was how to investigate this properly using a question and answer technique through hypnosis. And but before that, there was the Pascagoula case, which was in 1973, and the problem with the Pascagoula case was that the main people who were involved with it, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, Hickson described aliens that nobody had ever described before, so it didn't fit a pattern, and Parker refused to talk about it. So it was very difficult to get a handle on that case. With the Travis Walton case, a few years later, you have a situation where he's gone for 4.5 or 5 days, and you have actually two events. You have the event of people seeing him being knocked over by a ball of light from a UFO or whatever it was, and then his story, what happened to him after that. So you have two separate accounts here, essentially. He didn't remember much about the abduction event, but the other people remembered seeing him being abducted or seeing him being knocked over or whatever. The point is that Travis, who is remarkably intelligent and well-spoken, has steadfastly decided not to do hypnosis. So he only remembered about 20 minutes or so of what happened to him over a 5-day period.
Of course, that case was important because, apart from the fact that he was taken for 5 days, but it was one of the first cases where people were reporting beings which looked like sort of super perfect normal humans who were interacting with the aliens. We would now think of these beings as hybrids of some sort, whatever. To my recollection, he only did one hypnotic regression with it. And I've gotten to know Travis over the years, and I think extremely highly of him. He's a wonderful man. But the thing is that he's just not wanted to look into it anymore. The thing was sufficiently terrifying to him.
It was a very, very traumatic time. This incredible thing, that how can I relate this to, the guys that were with me, I wasn't really all that close of friends with. I could connect with them on what, the part of the experience that we had shared. But as far as anyone else, there were no experts. There were no one that I could really, connect with that understood this situation. And, I had this incredible, trauma to deal with. At the same time, an onslaught from the media and all sorts of things being said. They were trying to dismiss it as a drug hallucination, a transitory psychosis, just on and on, and that just had me completely, it was unexpected. I was off balance because, the depth of the reality for me had no bearing on people's reaction to it, and a lot of it had to do with fear. And
you were 22. You were still very young.
Yeah, I was only 22 and very unsophisticated about a lot of things about the so-called experts, and it was a tough time.
He'll talk about that one experience. And of course, I think one of the worst things in the world for him was the fact that the skeptics, the debunkers, jumped on him with both feet, and class, and he had to spend all of this time trying to defend himself. And that doesn't make you want to go more deeply into your recollections. At that time, 1975, we assumed maybe there 10 abductions took place, give or take a few. And many people didn't even like to accept the idea that there were 10. But it was still regarded, as with the Hill case, you were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I began having hypnosis done. I took these people for the first 7 years of my research. I took them to other people for the hypnotic regressions. It was the longest apprenticeship probably anybody who was doing hypnosis has ever had to go through. But when we did this, case after case emerged. And I began thinking, this isn't some 10 cases that, unlucky people in the wrong place. This is fairly widespread. And I think when I finally got around to writing my book in the late 70s, it came out in 81, Missing Time, perhaps the most radical thing that I wrote about and discovered is that the scope of this thing is enormous. This isn't just some very few people.
There's a sequence of episodes that do not appear in every abduction story, but if they appear, they tend to appear in the same order. Now, the first episode is the capture, which of course is going to happen in any case, but it in itself turns out to be a complex episode. You'll either have people seeing a UFO, it comes nearer, and then at some point something starts to go funny. There's something about their consciousness or their awareness of the environment, or the environment itself, as the case may be, that starts to become very strange. Things aren't perceived as they normally would be. They have odd feelings. And then there's going to be some kind of appearance of alien beings, or a time lapse. Sometimes the time lapse occurs first, sometimes the beings appear first. But anyway, there will be a loss of consciousness, and then the things that aren't remembered immediately after the event will be that these alien beings take the individual onto the spaceship, which may either be landed or it may be in the sky and pulls them up. Now the alternative is they wake up at night, they feel a sense of paralysis, alien beings come into the room and spirit them away again. So it's a slightly different beginning, but the two converge. You go into the ship. Then the second episode begins, which is the examination. And this is almost always the first thing the aliens do. They start giving the captive a physical examination. This episode also has a lot of parts to it. The examination usually runs in the course of where the beings give a sort of tactile examination, touching the captive after having laid them out on a table, and then there's a scanning device or an eye-like device that comes down. And then there's some kind of neurological examination or an implant or removal of an implant. There's also the staring in the eyes of the captive.
The scanning.
Scanning, yeah, the mind scan.
Right.
And then there's the sexual removal, body fluids removal. It can be other body parts too, but it always comes down to the sexual part. Then there may be some kind of follow-up, some kind of mental examination, some kind of scenarios that appear that seem to be some kind of mental or emotional test for the captive. Then there's a third episode, which is a conference or some kind of communication between the captive and at least one of the aliens. It can be, kind of a one-on-one conversation. It can be a sort of lecture. It can be a sort of showing of images of some kind. And this isn't quite as well organized an episode, but
is there any thematic to that?
Yeah, there are themes to what the aliens say, which is almost always some kind of a warning that a time of tribulation is at hand, and a promise that the aliens are going to help, and they charge the captive with some kind of mission or purpose.
Usually this warning is ecological.
Yeah, most often. And the mission is to somehow ameliorate the effects, but the person doesn't really know what their mission is. It's something they'll understand when the time is right. That's pretty much the way it goes.
Bud Hopkins, of course, is one of the great pioneers, if not the great pioneer in this area. And he wrote a book called Missing Time in 1980, which came out in 1981. And in that book, he took 7 individuals, which was the first time that there had been a sort of comparative study of that sort, who had all been abductees, and put them all together and showed that there were certain similarities that you just couldn't overlook, that it wasn't sort of all over the map like we had been seeing before, that in fact that they all had unusual scars on their body, or a lot of them did, and that they weren't crazy, and that they were actually missing from their normal environments, and that there was all sorts of things he found. And to me, the book, I at that time in 1980, 81, was of the mind that the abductions were primarily psychological. And therefore, when I met Bud Hopkins, I had not bothered to read his book, because why waste the time? And but when Bud began to show me what he was doing, and he actually introduced me to an abductee, then I read the book, and the book, of course, was, I think that Missing Time really began modern research into the subject of abductions. It was a groundbreaking book. It was a very, very, very important book. Now, there have been many books written beforehand, but his book had a seriousness to it, using a psychologist to do hypnosis. It had a methodology to it that other ones didn't have. It made sense on many levels that other ones didn't. It had a completeness to it that other ones didn't, and I became interested in the subject then.
What I also discovered and wrote about at the time was the fact that this seemed to be something that happens again and again in someone's life. Up until that point, everybody thought, whether it's Travis or Charlie Hickson and whatnot, it was a one-time shot. But and Charlie and I have talked about some recollections of his that go back to earlier times too. Mm-hmm. So suddenly it was a much more targeted thing. The person was abducted again and again, and then I discovered that there were particular kinds of marks on people afterwards, that scars and these straight line cuts and so on remained. And all this was really new. And then I discovered that it seemed to happen in families, that a child of abductee parents might have the same thing happen to him or her. So suddenly the thing expanded exponentially as a possibility, instead of these little few accidental things that happen. The point about this range of aspects of the phenomenon that I had really sort of uncovered and was writing about in Missing Time for the first time is that I was, in a certain sense, sticking my neck out, because other researchers are going to say, well, I've never found anything like this myself. There's nothing to this. Or counterintuitive evidence is going to come forward and so forth. And yet, in actual fact, people began saying, my gosh, when I explore these other avenues, I'm finding the same thing he found.
In 1987, 2 important books came out. Intruders, which was Bud Hopkins' second book, an extremely important book that sort of documented one woman and her family's experiences with the abduction phenomenon.
And raised a very important point, that point of the hybrid.
And raised the point of the hybrids, which Bud had already discovered. Bud had discovered back in the early 80s that women were being shown babies that looked odd, that looked sort of a mixture of human and alien, and he called them hybrids. He's the one who actually coined the phrase, coined the word for that type of person. And in Intruders, he also brought this in as a function of the abduction phenomenon and of this family, what had happened to this family, who this woman met who she considered to be her daughter there, or a daughter. And at the same time, almost in the same week, the book Communion came out, written by an abductee, a person who claims to be an abductee, Whitley Strieber. And Strieber was a professional writer and had best-selling books, and two of his books have been made into movies. And there had been a sort of bidding war for his book, and so he sold it to Morrow Company for a tremendous amount of money, and there was a huge publicity campaign for it, and he had hired his own publicist as well for it, and it hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 32 weeks, and it was #1 in the country for 19 weeks. That book had a tremendous impact societally. And the impact was not so much what he had to say, which was important enough, but was the illustration on the cover done by a man named Ted Jacobs, who actually was a friend of Bud Hopkins and who introduced Whitley to him. And Ted Jacobs, no relation to me, did this sort of staring alien that absolutely frightened the devil out of people who might have had these experiences. They became scared to death. People told me they saw the book in a bookstore and they just ran. They ran out of the mall and kept running. They were so frightened. Or people were drawn to it eerily. They couldn't stop looking at it. And some of these people eventually wound up with doing hypnosis with Bud or with me. And they would always say, you know, I had that book, I bought that book, and I could never look at it, and I kept it covered down so I didn't have to have that alien staring at me. But I know that there's something was wrong. The shape of the head was wrong. There was something wrong with it. And of course they were correct. The aliens don't look like that. They have different shaped heads than what Ted Jacobs painted, essentially. And they all knew it. Oddly enough, well, it's not odd if you know anything about the abduction phenomenon, but the starkness of the staring eyes is what affected them. And so what Communion did was it pried loose hundreds, if not thousands of people in the society who understood right away that they might have had these experiences, and this is what they had seen, these eyes, this being who was staring at them, but the head was wrong.
How was it wrong?
It was too flat.
Too flat?
After 1987, the media became much more interested in the abduction phenomenon, and there was sort of an avalanche of shows that featured it, and it was a very good ratings getter and so forth. And so it became much more current in popular culture and in popular mythology, let's just say, certainly in popular thought. In 1991, Bud Hopkins and I were commissioned to do a poll to see how many people out there might have had abduction experiences. The problem is that you can't ask a person if they've had an abduction experience, because this is a phenomenon where people forget what has happened to them within seconds of it happening. It is also a phenomenon that is lifelong, that begins in infancy, and that occurs with fairly regular consistency and sometimes with great frequency. In spite of that, people still don't know what happened to them, so they interpret odd experiences which they know they've had as religious, or as New Agey, or as traveling on the astral plane, or as near-death experiences, or whatever it is that the society allows them to interpret it as. But being abducted is not one of those things that the society will allow. So they know that they've had a lifetime of strange experiences, whereas their friends haven't. So we couldn't just ask them, have they been abducted? So what we did was we understood the methodological problems in this. I know it's been criticized by people who have no idea what they're talking about. But in fact, what we did is we did a long test of the questions we were going to ask with all sorts of people who were abductees and all sorts of people who were non-abductees, and we saw how they answered the questions. We could only ask 10 questions approximately, and we winnowed about 60 questions down to 10 that we thought that abductees answered yes to in very high proportion, and non-abductees answered no to in very high proportion. And those were some of the questions we asked, along with a couple of control questions. One question was, does the word trondant, which Bud Hopkins sort of made up, but in fact is a word we learned, but not in use. Right. Does the word trondant have special meaning for you? Anybody who answered yes was dropped from the poll. And the other one was, have you ever seen a UFO? And we have had statistics on that since 1949. So we knew early on how the statistics about seeing a UFO have gone. We knew pretty well, with all sorts of polls taken to the Gallup organization and other organizations, what the numbers should be like. So if the numbers were much higher, then we knew that there's something wrong with the poll. Right. It wasn't a good cross-section of the country. Well, the numbers were 7%, the lowest that had ever been recorded up to that time for have you seen a UFO, which was good, because that was a conservative poll. The poll was asked face-to-face, which they don't do anymore in polling, and it was an omni poll, but with omni polls, you're asked a series of questions that have to do with toothpaste and deodorant and flying saucers and all sorts of things. We stipulated, and they agreed to, that they would only ask questions that had to do with political events or sociological events, and nothing that had to do with advertising, so that the person who was answering the poll questions knew it was a serious poll. Okay. We then asked these questions, none of which were you ever abducted? The best we could do was, well, when we got the numbers were so high in terms of answering yes that we knew that something was wrong politically. We could not go forward with these numbers. They were too high. So we arbitrarily made the numbers smaller by saying that we will take, of the 10 questions, 5 will be the 5 highest indicator questions, which we decided, and 5 would be the lower indicator questions. And if you answered, if you didn't answer yes to 3 or more of the higher indicator questions, you didn't make the poll. So if you answered yes to, let's just say, 7 questions out of 10, and you didn't answer yes to 3 of the higher indicator questions, you're dropped from the poll. Answering yes to any one of those questions was a good indicator that you might have had abduction experiences, even one. So we made it so they had to answer yes to a whole bunch of these questions to make the poll. Otherwise, they were just dropped. And when we did that, we cooked the numbers down to an ultra-conservative 2% of the American public has had experiences that abductees have had before they knew they were abductees. And that's as good as we could do. That poll has stood up. There have been all sorts of attempts to show how the numbers are wrong. The numbers aren't wrong. The numbers are really good. They've had other polls which showed the numbers are lower. Some have showed the numbers are higher. But that poll remains still one of the best ever taken, and giving us the clearest indication in a most conservative way imaginable about how many people have had abduction experiences. Now, we can't really tell until you investigate each and every one of them. But you have to remember, we did 3 2,000-person scientifically randomized sweeps across the country. 6,000 people were interviewed for that poll. It was the largest poll of its type ever taken, and it was done scientifically by the Roper organization. And the plus minus on that error rate was only 1.4%. So we had a very interesting poll, People have liked to take pot shots at it. And sociologists have tried to say, well, the numbers are here. And Carl Sagan said, well, this and that. The fact remains that this is still one of the best polls taken. There have been other attempts to do it, most of them inferior. People ask them straight out, have you ever been abducted? The problem is that about 1 million people will say yes if you believe the numbers. But usually it falls within the plus minus. It doesn't rise above the plus minus. But that has happened. And then people have tried to add questions about conspiracy. Do you believe in conspiracy? The sort of extraneous questions and things like that. However, those numbers it's a very good poll, and those numbers hold up very well, I think.
2% of the population is still a huge number of people.
We couldn't get it down any lower than 2%. We wanted to. We just couldn't do it because the real numbers were just much too high.
Really?
That we couldn't get it down to more than to that.
What did that mean to you at that point?
Well, we knew that the numbers were wrong. Okay. We knew that right away that 2% was wrong, but it was impossible. We knew that no matter what number we came up with, it was going to be too high, no matter what it was.
All right, so if it was wrong.
But it was conservative, and we really didn't know. And if we were ridiculously rigid and ultra conservative, we would probably be more accurate. I don't know whether that's true or not. We may have been more accurate, we may not have been. But at least we were covering ourselves, and 2% is one hell of a lot of people in real numbers. You take 2% of 300 million people, that's 6 million right there. That's a lot of people. It's too many people. It's just plain too many. No matter what number it is, it's too many. You have to remember that most people thought that you're dealing with hundreds of people, maybe. Not anywhere close to thousands or millions. That just doesn't make any sense.
There's at least 2 reasons why I think abductions aren't as frequent. In part, abductions are kind of they were faddish in the 90s, but not faddish like hula hoops or something. They were faddish in a way like they gave people a script they could use to explain anomalous experiences they'd already had anyway in their life. So the 2 Roper polls have been done on abductions, the first and then the second in the late 90s. And there's a vast difference between the estimates about the number of abductees between the 2 polls. I.e., the abduction incidents dropped by 50 or 60 or 70% in only 4 or 5 years. Well, that makes no sense, okay? Unless, of course, there's other factors involved with being an abductee. Okay? So that's one thing I think about. But the other is that in the late 90s and in the early aughts or O's, whatever we call this, the decade we're in, we being the UFO Coalition, were working on an abduction research project where we were actually placing devices in the home abductees and attempting to measure physical phenomena there. In the course of that, I literally had to interview hundreds of people around the country to find subjects for the study. So I've talked to many, many, many people fairly recently about their experiences. And what I found is that when you question them closely about the frequency of occurrence, which we had to because we wanted to find people who were abducted at least more than once in their lifetime, it turns out that everything is very vague, except a few things. In other words, yes, they've had 1 or 2 experiences, whatever they were, but everything else is more along the lines of, I woke up this morning and I think I saw a spot of blood in my nose, and I think last night was one of those nights again. Now, it may well be, but it's vague. And so I can't, and those 2 things are things I've grasped. The Roper poll, I understand. I've talked to hundreds of potential abductees or real abductees, and I just don't see these large numbers there.
Well, it is around this time, around 1991 or so, that John Mack from Harvard enters into the area. John had a spectacular career at Harvard for 30 years, winner of the 1976 Pulitzer Prize in biography for a biography of T.E. Lawrence, and a Harvard psychiatrist and founders of one of the institutes at Harvard, and on the op-ed page of the New York Times all the time, and a tremendous career, extraordinarily intelligent, very insightful. And he immediately understood when he went to one of Hopkins' lectures and Bud can explain this more than I can, obviously, but he immediately understood that this would be very difficult to prove as being psychologically originated. In other words, the abduction phenomenon is either psychological for whatever reason you want to bring in, no matter what. It is psychological or it's actually happening. So John comes on the scene, and we are thrilled because John has got a sort of cachet, obviously, about him that we obviously don't have. And John is plugged into an intellectual community that is really extraordinary. And John has the ability, therefore, to influence other people in a positive way for us and for the phenomenon and for perhaps an intellectual and scientific engagement with the phenomenon that we have been hoping for. Sure. I mean, so we were very, very thrilled with that. But John had sort of another take on things. John had studied with Stanislav Grof and
Transpersonal psychology.
Right, and he was very much into consciousness studies and transference of consciousness and the transformational aspects of being abducted and the spiritual aspects of being abducted. What exactly was happening, he wasn't much interested in. And the methodology to ask the correct questions was not high on his priority list. So when he began to do his work, the first thing we noticed was that he was not coming to us for advice. After all, we had many years of experience in this between the two of us, Bud Hopkins and I. And he just went off and started to do it. And he was not given the gift that I was given. So he made the fatal mistake of simply believing everything that people say at face value and not understanding that people will say things that are not true in hypnosis. And you've got to be there to be careful and to watch that and to catch that. So he believed everything he heard, and his idea of what the phenomenon was very different than what Bud and I had been finding for years. But he never quite believed that we were on the right track even before he began to do hypnosis.
Well, I think one of the key differences was in their approach, in that I believe that Hopkins and Jacobs were focused on the aliens themselves. They wanted to know about what this alien culture was, what the species was, what their methods were. John's approach was a little bit different, in that I think his interest was actually in the people. He was looking at how the people were changed by the experience. And that's sort of the common theme which all of his explorations were about. You know, we investigated T.E. Lawrence. He was looking to see how a person, when exposed to a completely different culture, how their relationship to the world changed. That happened to this T.E. Lawrence, who was a British officer stationed in the Middle East, who he basically embraced the concept that the Middle East could unite and become a powerful country. So when he met these alien encounter experiencers, he was seeing people who were taking on a different kind of cultural identity, an identity in which they were related not only to their own country, but to life in the world and life beyond our world. So that was what fascinated John most and what kept him interested for years. The matter of fact, the nuts and bolts aspects of the experiences, John was first to admit that was beyond his area of expertise. He was a psychiatrist, so he was using the art of speaking to people. That's fantastic for learning how people have changed, but as an investigative method, it's not going to turn up hardcore evidence. So I think that was the beginning of the divide.
I had the great privilege and pleasure of talking to John Mack at some length. I know that he's been blasted a number of times by skeptics and even some people within his own institution. I found him to be a brilliant individual. I was impressed with his approach, and particularly impressed with his second book, The Passport to the Cosmos. If you look at the second book, what it does is it says, well, maybe abductions aren't real in the sense that people are being beamed up through the ceiling, but because what he found was, for example, that somebody would report being abducted. Some would be in the same room at the same time, and they'd notice the person asleep on the couch. But what Mack did was he attached tremendous psychological significance to abductions. And I think this is He's referred to as a positivist as compared to a realist, like Jacob, say, oh, gee, this is really happening. And I think that there are transformational kinds of effects for some people of abduction. Some are terrified, some don't make sense of it. But in the hands of somebody like Mack, who would help people work through and understand these experiences, the outcome could be positive. There have certainly been other cases where people have had anomalistic or mystical kinds of experiences that can be channeled. I think that one of the reasons for Mack's success in working with individual abductees was that he did see it as positive, and he helped other people to see it in the same way.
He already sort of had, I think, a kind of a template, in essence, into which he would place this phenomenon. And that's what essentially he did. So he wrote his major book, which was called Abduction, and I noticed that he put in transcripts of his hypnosis, and I knew immediately when reading transcripts, I knew instantly what the problem was. He was simply going along with what other people said and agreeing with them and believing what they were saying, no matter what they said, and then asking them to come forward with more information about this material that was obviously, in my opinion, confabulation, and building what I called a mutually confirmational fantasy. This is a fantasy built by the hypnotist and the subject. And he did that over and over again. He got all sorts of stuff about going back to the pyramids and, and everything that matched nothing that Bud and I and other serious researchers had gotten. Nothing at all, except the standard kind of scenario, giving people an examination, all that. And when there was stuff like taking eggs and sperm, he just dismissed all that stuff. He didn't think that was important. And he emphasized other things that were oftentimes confabulatory that were important. So the book was not a forward step for us.
The emphasis on the part of some researchers to stress the physical aspects of the experience seemed to be almost a concession to the culture. Like, rather than approach the experience and say, well, this is a very strange experience, very surreal, has all these strange elements, some researchers try to reduce it and say, no, it's very physical. It's a metal saucer landing on your yard. And that might be one part of it, but it seems almost dishonest. It seems like it's an attempt to buy into the public's expectations of what an alien encounter is. So I don't appreciate when some people ignore the high strangeness of the experiences. I think that you have to embrace that. And that's what appealed to me about John, was that he embraced the spiritual component perhaps more than his colleagues. But that was intentional. He wanted to make sure that there was balance by emphasizing that element in his books. Well, as John has told it, he was fairly high profile in the media. He was getting a lot of good coverage for his book. And the suspicion is that some Harvard donors might have become a little upset that their alma mater was becoming associated with this subject. So he went to the dean's office to let the dean know that he was on this publicity tour, and he would be for the next several weeks. And the way he describes it was, at that point, it was too late. He walks into the room, and there was another dean there, and they give him a letter saying that this informal committee has been appointed to just investigate and see why he had the opinions that he had. And it was a little odd in that there had been no formal complaints brought against him. There was no specific allegation of any wrongdoing. It was an open-ended investigation with no apparent structure. It was simply a free-flowing investigation, and he didn't know what to make of it. And initially he thought that it was simply something harmless, but it developed into a 14-month excruciating experience where he had to defend himself rigorously against a panel of people who weren't, for the most part, were not psychiatrists, were not philosophers, really didn't have the background or expertise to even appreciate his work, let alone understand it. Well, I'm not sure why it took 14 months, but my impression, layman's impression, not part of the Harvard system at all, was that the Inquisition itself was the form of punishment. Because when they finally produced their report and presented it to the dean read their report, determined that nothing that they said merited any action, released a press release saying that John remained a faculty member in good standing, and that was it. So in a sense, the Inquisition itself was the message. Watch yourself because we're watching you. And that was actually what made some of the other Harvard faculty rather uncomfortable. Alan Dershowitz wrote a good op-ed where he was saying that kind of message in an open-ended investigation is unfair. So they finally brought it to a close, I think, after public scrutiny started to make some people uncomfortable. I think he felt that the experience that he was investigating was more important than the political system at Harvard. So he was willing to let the Harvard system, gnaw at him. It wasn't something that would stop him. I mean, as I said earlier, the interview process where he was speaking to experiencers was a personally satisfying experience for him. Mm-hmm. It was changing him from a psychiatrist into a kind of philosopher. Mm-hmm. And that passion wasn't going to be extinguished by an ad hoc committee. Well, I think John's influence was the fact that John, as a psychiatrist, was able to move people past their fear of the experiences and the trauma, just as if you had been through any terrifying experience, whether it's rape or being shot or anything like that. If you're caught in the fear, your perspective is not going to be wide enough to see the whole experience. The fact that other researchers report fear, well, it doesn't really surprise me. I mean, that's going to be the primary experience first, is fear.
How would you describe that primary? What is the reason for that fear?
I think the fear of an alien encounter experience, the fear once you've been through it, it undercuts all of your assumptions about reality. Which sounds like maybe is not that big a deal. Sounds like it's purely philosophical problem, but you live your life assuming that reality is one way. That people can only come into your house by walking through a door. Okay, but when that element of certainty is taken away, you involuntarily question everything about yourself, which had been based upon those assumptions. So in a way, your personality is deconstructed temporarily, simply because you suddenly have immense doubt about reality, which taints your assumptions about yourself. So people's identities sort of fall apart when they become aware that they're having these experiences.
But eventually he realized the UFO research was not for him. And he dropped out of UFO research, closed up his peer group he had, as he called it, at Harvard, 2 years before he died, and just began to work more in spiritual realms. And that was what he was more suited for. That was really a better fit for him.
I think John was initially tantalized by the possibility that this experience could leave behind material proof. But after speaking to experiencer after experiencer, who most of them have repeat experiences throughout their lifetimes, none could bring forth any hardcore physical evidence. All they had were memories. So I think eventually John moved away from the idea that material evidence was part of it.
I began to think that the process of hybridization, which I had envisioned before as primarily taking sperm and eggs and then altering the embryo or the zygote, and then leading to this sort of a bell-shaped curve of part of them look alien, part of them look human, most of them look in the middle. That was probably true, but not the whole story. And then I began to realize that what they were doing is that they were adding DNA from hybrids to the sperm and egg, and they were getting a skewed bell-shaped curve that was looking more and more like humans. And if you do this enough time, you just get beings who look more and more human-like, more and more. You get a refining of the species, in a sense. And that apparently is what has been happening. Although how the process, I'm still a little bit unclear of the process, and there were some very pointed questions asked me about this once by a person who knew what he was talking about that I couldn't answer. And so I don't know all the medical procedures that occur here in that sense. But I do know that there is a spectrum of hybrids who look mainly alien and look mainly human, and some look really, really human. Then people would begin to describe to me how they would be taken into a room. These are abductees, and their attention would be directed to a screen-like device. They all look up at the screen, and the person will say, and I've written a couple of these kinds of events up, although I heard many of them. The person will see a picnic, for example. And at the picnic, there'll be people who are playing ball and who are grilling and who are standing around talking this and that. And they'll hear in their mind's eye, in their mind's ear, "Can you tell the difference between you and us?" And the person will look carefully at the screen and say, "No. Everybody looks the same to me, you know." And they'll say, "See? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that excellent? Soon we will all be together. Soon we will be here and we will all be living together. Isn't that wonderful?" Or they will see, here's another case, it's a group shot of all sorts of people, like a high school shot of all the class on steps, you know, that sort of thing. And they'll say, "Can you pick out us among you here?" And the person will look and try to figure it out and they'll say, no, I can't. And they'll say, "See, isn't that wonderful? Soon we will all be together." And I began to hear this a lot by people who were not aware of anybody else's testimony or anything like that, or, you know, who were just saying that, and who didn't really understand the meaning of what it was either. And then people would say, then these beings would tell them soon there was going to be a big change. There'll be a big change, and you're going to be a very important part of the change, and, you know, you'll have a job to do, and you'll be very pleased to do it. And to the abductees who don't know what they're talking about. But this will happen soon. Everything's going to happen soon. It's going to be happening soon. Now it's the change. We're going to have a change. The change is coming soon. Well, I began, you know, when you hear things for the first time, you always put it on the back burner waiting for validation from other people who are unaware of the testimony. Sure. Well, so the first few times I heard this, you just blow it off. You just think, well, I'll wait. If I never hear it again, there is no change, you know. But I began to hear it over and over again from a wide variety of people. Something was happening in the future. Some change was going to happen. They had some role in the future. This was going to happen. They began to convince me, because the first time I heard it, it came out of the blue. And the second time I heard it, it came out of the blue. I mean, it sounded like I was leading him to it. I didn't even believe it had happened in the first place. So, because you have to wait for confirmation. So you don't, it's not like I'm leading people, it's like they're leading me. I instituted controls for that eventually, which I can tell you about if you want. They're fun controls. But just to show you how that doesn't work the way people think it works. But the point is that after a while, I began to think, well, maybe there is going to be something happening in the future. Maybe this is leading to something. And I was realizing at this time that we're not dealing with an experiment here. That this is not a situation where people are just being put on a table and are looked at and say, what's this, what's that? And you pull off somebody's arm and look inside their body and see what's in there, you know. It's not like that. That this is, in fact, a program. And as a program, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it is goal-directed. They are doing this for a reason, and this is a global phenomenon. And the amount of time and energy and material and personnel that are involved in this program is fantastic. Unbelievable. It's literally beyond imagination. And I'm getting letters from around the world, people having these experiences, so as is Bud Hopkins and all other abduction researchers who are known. Then people began to be much more specific about what they would be doing in the future. And a lot of what they were doing was crowd control. Standing on a sidewalk saying, move along, it'll be okay, don't worry, everything is all right, just keep moving, move in this direction, move that way, And I had a whole bunch of people telling me that this is what they're going to be doing. And I'm talking to a person who has a PhD in English, telling me, well, that's what she's going to be doing. She's going to be standing on a corner directing people. And I'm talking to a person who is a junior high school, middle school dropout, telling me the same exact story. Well, they'll be standing directing people. They don't know particularly why, but they have to. This is what they know that they'll be doing. Plus a whole variety of other things. Those are just an example. So people would be saying these things like they'd be doing crowd control work, of all things to think of. And I'm thinking to myself, well, why don't they envision themselves in the future as being an ambassador or something that's, that would be obviously some psychological thing that they would do, which would enhance their role in this new change or whatever. But in fact, they'd be doing mundane things and helping with abductions and helping and doing this and doing that and all sorts of other things. And it was hard to imagine, but I began to realize that this was a program, if you were to believe what these beings were saying to the abductees, or then telling it to me, that this was a program of integration into the society, that they were integrating into the society and they would be looking like us, just like in science fiction. Just exactly what I don't want to hear. It goes all the way back to if you ever think this is science fiction, or if you ever think that this is just a matter of popular culture, people are picking it up, well, this is it. But this is where the evidence led, and that has got to be emphasized. It didn't lead in 1,000 different directions, as it should have if it were psychologial. It didn't lead back to the importance of the individual, as it would have in psychological cases. It didn't lead into all sorts of crazy areas. All the stories, all of them that I heard, led to one direction. And that this was, in fact, an integration program. People were filling in pieces of the puzzle, and it was leading in one direction, a direction I did not like and did not want to hear. Now, the problem is this. From the beginning, from the Barney and Betty Hill case, there has been one constant among many. But the one constant I'm gonna focus on now is the constant that Barney and Betty Hill said, that they made a left-hand turn down the road and then went a mile, and then they knew that they had to sort of close their eyes and go like that. In other words, they were being neurally controlled from afar. That is the case with every single abduction event ever recorded, period, that has been investigated. Now, the one exception here is Travis Walton. The one exception here is the Antonio Villas-Boas case, and that was an uninvestigated case. But, and that was in 1957. But the fact is that is a constant in 100% of the abduction cases. Without that, there would be no abduction phenomenon. People would indeed reach under their pillow and get out their Magnum 45 and blow their heads off. They would call the police. They would, they would do that. They'd run, whatever it is that they would do. There would be no abduction phenomenon. So that must be, and that is in place in every single abduction. Every single one. Now, the point here is that if these beings integrate into the society who look just like you and I, they have that ability, and we do not. That makes us inferior, and it makes them superior. When you look through history and you see technologically superior people confronting tribal societies, for example, it is not the tribal societies that survive and flourish. It is the ones who have the better weapons, generally speaking, and you see the extinction of tribes throughout the world over the years. And the point is that this is one of those instances where you have a superior technologically, not necessarily physically technologically, although there is that, but biologically superior, neurologically superior, that is confronting a neurologically inferior society, and that makes this a catastrophic event. even if it is anecdotal evidence. And I understand that this is anecdotal evidence, it's human testimony, it's human memory the testimony retrieved through hypnosis administered by amateurs. I understand that. I understand how weak this is.
Do you ever wish you're wrong?
All the time. All the time. I went through a down period where I was very, very, very burned out, and I was very depressed over various things that had happened in my life, and I just couldn't do this research anymore. I would have sessions with people, and I dread that they would actually come over, and I'd have to do it, and all that. And this went on for a long time. And then, as came out, I remember doing a session with somebody, and this is after I'd already done it for 15 years. And after 15 years, I remember doing the session, and I thought to myself, this really is happening. This really is happening. It's like this. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I realized that, but it dawned on me again. It's so easy to think that this isn't. It's so easy to slip into this idea of, no, this can't possibly be happening. I was actually slipping into that. But this really is happening. As crazy as it sounds, as off the wall as it sounds, this really is happening. It is frightening. It's terrorizing in a sense. It is not something I ever expected to hear. I never expected to go in this direction, let alone leading people in this direction. I would like to lead them into the direction where I become the king of the world and the superior person. That would be good. But in fact, it's not. It was unimaginable to me when I started doing this research what this was all about. Just not imaginable. I could not have ever imagined where I'd be today with this phenomenon. And I have kicked and screamed all the way through as I have slowly moved. People have said, oh, well, hybrids are here, and I just blew all that stuff off. And now I think to myself, in my own research, where I can have control of it, and I know my weaknesses, and I know the weaknesses of the methodology, and I know the strengths of the methodology, I now can say to myself that this is an integration program and that hybrids will be integrating into the society and might be doing it now. And I can't get away from that. I can't rationalize that in any psychological way.
In terms of Dave's marshaling the evidence, it's all pointing in that direction. I mean, there isn't anything in it that you can read as being a divergence into, oh yes, they really want to come and learn about our computers or hear our music or become artists or who knows what, or cure cancer. We don't get that. We don't get anything that diverges from this. Mm-hmm. Yet, this we're talking about is really a future thing which we do not understand yet fully. In human terms, anthropomorphic terms, it does look like ultimately some kind of takeover. I'm not as brave as Dave is to lay it all out. I don't want to depress people with a kind of future that looks as bleak as that. When I call Dave braver than I, he counters by saying, or more foolhardy. But the point is, neither one of us knows, but Dave takes the road of clarity about the material. I would not have written that book myself because my personality maybe doesn't want to. I'm probably somebody in 1937 who would have thought that if you talk nice to Hitler, maybe things would be different, and Dave wasn't. But the point is, there is not much about it that one can look at with any degree of optimism.
These claims are enormously controversial because of their sensational nature and their incredible, far-reaching implications. The problem is that although these reports are very interesting and they come from people who don't seem to be crazy, in fact, psychological inventories of abductees indicate that these are not psychologically disturbed people. There are some really interesting patterns, including some very subtle ones, that connect the reports over time and space. But the kind of evidence, the kind of hard evidence that these things are occurring in the world within consensus reality never materialize. And so you have incredible stories, fantastic stories, matched up against very, very limited to non-existent objective evidence that they're happening in the world. There are no abduction cases that are the equivalent of good, solid UFO cases where you have multiple witnesses, instrumented observation, and those sorts of things. It becomes really difficult to know what to do with reports like these. Many ufologists become skeptical of them, say that this is just something that not necessarily a bunch of hoaxes, but some kind of extraordinary experience of consciousness or psychology that we don't know, that merely borrows images from UFOs, from the UFO literature, from science fiction, and so on, but really isn't related to the UFO phenomenon of the metallic disc that's seen by pilots, for example. Others want to link these with the contactee claims and say that this is just a more later version of the contactee model. I think that's wrong. I don't think that's true, because contactees and abductees really fundamentally different kinds of people. The abductees' stories are far stranger. You read the testimony of abductees, and you really have the sense that whatever happened to these people is extraordinarily strange and very hard to explain. But getting from very hard to explain to seeing this as the activity of physical, biological entities from other solar systems, that is a big, broad jump that nobody has been able to bridge.
The abduction phenomena is still a mystery, first of all, foremost to me. It is more puzzling than the UFO phenomenon in the sense that here we've had more attention paid to it. And I thought that eventually by now we would have at least had some more of a better clue as to what's happening. And we're still floundering. But it's definitely multi-causal, okay, in the sense that someone can report an experience, and someone else can report an experience very similar, and yet one could really be caused by sleep paralysis, and then the other is more mysterious, or one could be caused by the old hag phenomena, which is a little different than sleep paralysis, and so forth and so on, and a whole range of things, or just anomalous. People seem to have a certain type of people seem just to have anomalous things happen to them. All the time. That if you and I were in the room with them, we wouldn't even experience, but they're really experiencing something, and so they report it as such.
Okay, there is this physicality to it. And the physicality is a real physicality. People do come back with unusual scars in their body, fully formed scars, or cuts that don't bleed, or all sorts of other serious bruising and marks that they had, let's just say, at night. People are physically missing from their normal environments when they are abducted. As in the case of Travis Walton, search parties were sent out, or parents have searched for their kids and all the rest of that stuff. And the wife would say, well, you weren't in bed last night. Where the hell were you? I waited, stayed up for an hour, and you weren't there, and I just fell asleep again.
I certainly believe from investigations I've done, and of course things I've read about, that there are instances where people really do seem to be abducted. But the best evidence is missing time. It's not scars on people's bodies, which have not been well documented. It's certainly not implants. It's not a vague feeling, and I mean that's fine. But it's got to be something that can make you say, well, something mysterious happened here, you know. And the most mysterious things is someone should have been here, and they're not there, and they're actually gone. And while we don't have photos of a car with someone not in it by the side of the road, we do have, at least in my judgment, some pretty solid testimony about those kinds of missing time lapses. Bottom line, though, is that I can't say that aliens are abducting people, because for that you really do need hard evidence, and we don't have it. Now, Dave Jacobs, has been very assiduous about working with a small, group of people and interviewing them repeatedly. And I'll grant whatever he's learned with them, but Dave has to extrapolate to the vast numbers. He extrapolates based on what he hears from his group about what's going on and all this, and then he extrapolates on the Roper poll. Well, I'm not a great fan of the Roper poll in terms of being estimate the number of abductees. So it's that reasoning that leads me to say that I just don't think they're as frequent, rather than just, I hope, not a knee-jerk reaction.
In these kind of paranormal worlds, everything is methodology. This is where it all comes from. This is where you have to be very, very, very careful, especially when you're dealing with the landscape of the mind, when you're dealing with people's imaginations, when you're dealing with people's memories. You've got to be extremely careful. The methodology started to be developed early on because we could see what was wrong early on, I think. Bud Hopkins was the first person who began to take abductees to a psychologist who would do standard hypnosis on them, but she, as I remember, was so frightened of leading them in any way that she would simply bring them back to this agreed-upon event and then not ask questions at all and wait for them to just remember. That's not a good methodology, as we have learned. But what happened was Bud began to figure out a way in which you could ask purposely misleading questions and see if you could catch them by misleading them into things that we knew were wrong or were just being made up on the spot by Bud. So he began to understand that you could, with hypnosis, deter people from saying something that didn't happen, and encourage people to say things that actually did happen to them. Now, maybe I shouldn't use the word encourage because it sounds like it's coming from him, but at least find contradictions in what they were saying, that they would have to deal with in some way. We've learned that when people remember things consciously, it's counterintuitive. You would assume, well, if they remember something consciously, that must be much more logical and rational and correct than if they remembered it under hypnosis with all its problems. In fact, the opposite is true. With hypnosis, people tend to remember things a lot more clearly, a lot more accurately, and with less confabulation than just remembering things consciously. When people remember abduction events, the abduction event might last from A to Z, let's just say. And what people will remember is part of A, skip to G, skip to M, back to C, then a completely distorted version of O, and that's it. Then they put this thing together as a logical progression, A, B, C, D. They don't realize where it's coming from. And then they will tell you this story about what happened to them that they remember straight out. And you listen to it, and for years and years and years, we thought this was an abduction event. And they were sort of all over the place. Right. But once we began to realize that these kinds of accounts are notoriously wrong, that they are erroneous, not because the person is saying something wrong, but because the person is just remembering it wrong, that we began to learn the methodology for how to do hypnosis with abductees. And it had to do with being skeptical about what was being said. It had to do with being extremely chronological on a second-by-second basis, and lots of other techniques that are used where suddenly people began to describe whole abduction events just like everybody else, and then say to me afterwards, this is not the way I thought it was going to turn out, or this isn't what I thought I remembered it, but this is what did happen, in fact. Then I began to institute a series of controls in hypnosis and work hard on methodology and really think hard about the methodology of questioning and how to do this and how to best do it to get the best and most trustworthy accounts that I can, regardless of what they said. And When I started doing that, then I began to get stories that didn't have people reaching out and touching other one's heads, and never had that. I never had that again for the next 22 years. Never had that again, or 20 years, I should say. And because it just doesn't happen. It's not a concept. And then I began to understand the role of confabulation, and I began to understand the role of false memories that are put into people's minds on purpose almost. And I began to understand the role of neural manipulation of short-term memory in this business. And I began to understand the role of how memory works and how memory decays and how people remember things and how they put things together, and how in this particular type of phenomenon, they put things together very wrongly oftentimes. And once I did that, I think I worked out an effective methodology that is workable. I've written a book on methodology, unpublished so far, and that I think one of the great problems with abduction research is that everybody is sort of not on the same page, let's put it that way. And there's no standardization of methodology, and I'd like to standardize that methodology. I'd like to be the one who does that. I think that might be one of my more important contributions. So when other people do this kind of work, we will have a way of checking whether they're doing it right or not.
I've stopped using hypnosis years ago. Yeah, so, yeah. And the real problem is the content of the experience. In other words, there's missing time, weird things happen to people, there's no doubt about that. The actual what goes on during the abduction experience, I'm very uneasy about being too confident that we really know.
The abduction phenomenon has generated a lot of potential solutions. One says it's strictly a psychological sort of phenomenon, where the usual explanation is that it's a combination of things, or this seems to be the convergent explanation of that most people would be willing to accept now. That the answer is you may have a basis in experience, but it's something like sleep paralysis. Then you have people who are somewhat susceptible to suggestion. They go to an investigator who's interested in abductions. This investigator has an agenda. The investigator leads them to see the odd experience they had in terms of of that agenda, and by a combination of leading and willingness to follow and a lot of cultural familiarity with the idea of abductions, that becomes imposed over the sleep paralysis experience, and the result is a vivid, well-believed-in, imaginary abduction experience.
In the pre-selection of the person who she's coming to for hypnosis,
Look at,
there is an unconscious agenda set up. Has to be.
This is true, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Nothing you can do.
We try to select out. We try also, but once they're there,
yourself,
right? There's the only thing. But I've had people who thought they were abductees who come to me and aren't.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I had people who thought that they were sexually abused and weren't, and it was an abduction event.
Yeah.
I remember once I did a session with a woman who felt she was sexually abused, and she said there was something funny about this, and there was some guy down the street, some older boy, she said, who sort of lured her down into his other place, and she went down, and then she didn't remember going down there, and next thing she knew, it was sort of a sexual abuse thing, and we did a session on it. And it was a sexual abuse thing. And she did remember the guy. And she did remember going down the stairs. And she remembered everything about it. And there was no doubt about it. This was a teenager molesting her.
I'm glad it didn't turn out to be an error.
No. You see, it's not like they're impelled to say it every. I mean, you know what I mean? It doesn't work that way.
I know, but how do you filter out that agenda?
You have to just investigate it, and then you say to her, "I don't think this doesn't sound like an abduction." Then we'll go on to the next one. So, but some of them aren't.
For the most part, the majority of people definitely are normal. They're just like you and I in most respects. Not quite. Susan Clancy, in her book on abductees, picked up on a little of this in the sense that they tend to be people who are more open to anomalous experiences in general. They're more feelers in life than they are rational people, like I would be. I've never been abducted. Don't ever expect to be for that reason. Quite honestly, but that isn't anything wrong with them. That's just their style, their psychological style, and in fact might be admirable. Otherwise, with a few exceptions, they're not fantasy prone. They're not prone to psychopathology. They're just basically normal. And they've had these anomalous experiences.
I tend to side with the skeptics on abductions, to tell you the truth. And the reason that I side with the skeptics on abductions is it's where psychology and anthropology has made a lot of progress in the last 10, 15 years in terms of cultural narratives and how memory works, and not just sort of supposition. We've moved way beyond the early kinds of arguments where, the idea of memories implanted under hypnosis, that we're learning much more about the frailties and inadequacies of the human memory. It's not absolutely terrible, but it's really easy for memory to be altered, for things to be inserted, for things to be forgotten. And this is backed not just by arguments of people who have talked to, various reporters and whatnot of abductions, but through actual experimental kinds of research. And there are differences in information processing, including differences between abductees and non-abductees in terms of what constitutes memory. And the easiest way to summarize this is to say that what we take as memory, that it's a mixture of things that have actually happened to us, things that have happened to people that we know, and things that we've heard about on the media, that we forget where it came from. We may attribute it to ourselves. I have several stories I'd love to tell that I discovered in later life, stories to do with my family that they didn't happen to me. They happened to somebody else in the family, but I like to take it over. But very seriously, that there is a picture emerging of the kinds of psychological forces that could give people an abduction recollection. With the realists, they like to point to things such as convergence of detail, but everybody knows the abduction narrative. I think that's a point that I have to give to the skeptics. That if you look at various books that have been written about abductions, that there tends to be almost a forced convergence of detail, that there tends to be a suppression, you might say, or at least a downplaying of other kinds of odd experiences that the person might have had, things like that. That's not saying, I cannot say categorically no one has ever had contact with an extraterrestrial. I cannot say categorically that people 2 billion years beyond us might be having problems with elementary genetics. There's no real way to say it. But I can say I'm very, very skeptical. I need a lot more convincing before I go along with that one.
The idea that cultural sources are responsible for the consistency of abduction reports kind of runs aground on two problems. In the first place, as folklore shows us, people will take a story, but they will always vary it. They'll always add to it, change it, personalize it. In some way, make a new creation out of the old materials. We don't see that with the abduction stories. I mean, there'll be some degree of personalization, but as far as the actual phenomenology of the story, there's really surprisingly little variation. As many people who have told this story as many years as it's been around, you would think you'd see a lot more than you do, but it has stayed surprisingly consistent, even given that there are many investigators who have an agenda to press, or the TV, movies, tabloids, books have all tended to support the more usual version. But you'd still expect, if people are really depending on imagination, that the normal imaginary functions would take place. We get all kinds of variation with the urban legends, but we don't get them with the abduction story. So it's an oddity, whatever you want to make of it. Now, the second problem is that these stories were consistent from the start. You take the very early accounts before they became widely known. Before late 1977, when Close Encounters of the Third Kind sort of presented an image that everyone saw of what aliens should look like. Yet these stories were the same. The alien beings were very similar. The differences in the beings was in the same proportions then as it is now. So it's, once again, you might not make it a conclusive argument. It may not affect you that way, but it's certainly an oddity. It's a curiosity that's worth considering.
Well, in the absence of irrefutable or verifiable physical evidence, I think investigators in the field have turned to trying to understand the psychology of the experiencer. And I think that has given us some leads, in part in terms of what we know not to be the case. We know now that most people who report experiences with contact are not simply perpetrating hoaxes. That's to say, they truly believe that they've had these experiences. So attention is focused in on the nature and the determinants of those beliefs. One approach has been to examine a possible link between fantasy proneness, people who have characteristics of intense involvements in fantasy from a very early life and profound involvements in fantasy, and the UFO abduction experience. These individuals tend to claim that their fantasies from age 3 to adulthood tend to be as real. They're compelling, they're loaded with emotions, and they sometimes report problems distinguishing fantasy and reality. So the idea here is that some people may have a tendency or a propensity to interpret their experiences along unconventional lines consistent with what they imagine and believe to be true, and to tie these different elements of the very popular UFO narrative in the United States and Western Europe into a story that has personal relevance and meaning and significance, and that explains certain important aspects of their past and their present, and at the same time confers upon them a special identity as someone who's had unusual, important, and exotic experiences. Along with the trauma, there are a lot of dramatic elements. There oftentimes is an element or a component to the story of being taken aboard a spacecraft, of being subjected to a medical examination that's sometimes very aggressive and even violent. And that seems to be well integrated into the contemporary narrative that is associated with abductions. Experiments may be conducted, and one can say that those are traumatic. At the same time, they are very dramatic. They are as dramatic and poignant and associated with meaning. That is, what are these folks up to who are abducting citizens, as they are with personal trauma. And we also know that fantasies can be very real, especially for fantasy-prone people, and that they may experience the traumatic aspects of their fantasies or imaginings or memories, things they believed happened. But right alongside them, there is another narrative, and that is a narrative of hope, oftentimes for humanity, of a change in direction of the course of humanity as a function of visitations, and playing a very important personal role in change that's dramatic and may, in some instances, even be heroic. It's just one possible explanation. And some explanations may apply for one person, yet they may not apply for another. In fact, in terms of the research that's been conducted with experiencers and fantasy proneness, research is actually quite mixed. It's difficult to to study people with questionnaires, because when an experiencer encounters a questionnaire that might seem to invalidate their experience and relegate it to the realm of fantasy, you can understand how they might respond in a somewhat defensive manner. So this is a difficult area to really study.
What are the other potential explanations from a psychological standpoint?
Sleep paralysis has been offered as a second explanation. And
what is sleep paralysis?
Sleep paralysis is a sleep-related phenomena such that people oftentimes close to the time that they're waking up have an experience of a sensed presence, that they're paralyzed or immobilized, and it can be a very frightening experience not being able to wake up.
And this is because of the chemicals?
This is because of a glitch, basically, in one of the stages of sleep. And it can be very, very frightening, and it can be very, very real. And the sensed presence can be that of an alien-type figure. They can also feel as if they are moving. The reports are actually quite consistent with what many people report as part of an abduction scenario. Oftentimes, though, the experience doesn't evolve in a linear way from a single experience. It's cobbled together from trying to understand a variety of experiences. That may be the entry point. And then someone may try to explain that experience, not knowing anything about the physiology of sleep and the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, in terms of what they've read about or know about abduction experiences, and then begin to relate that to other experiences and spin from that a scenario that is pretty compelling to that individual, indicating that something happened. What is that? Well, one possibility is I was abducted, and then from there it becomes elaborated and enriched and grows or escalates in its compelling, emotionally compelling nature to the experiencer. So what starts off as an inexplicable experience gets spun out over time and thought about it and reading about it and possibly talking with people or undergoing hypnosis or simply becoming engaged with the well-known cultural narrative in terms of what happens into a story someone feels pretty confident actually happened to them.
One could extrapolate from that and argue that if somebody has a sleep paralysis experience and is particularly fantasy prone and is exposed to the cultural understanding of abductions, one might interpret that sleep experience as a bedroom abduction. So that's one of the theories that's still being touted quite a bit today. It would be hard to use that as an explanation for all abductions. In particular, many abductions take place out in the open. They have nothing to do with the bedroom or being in bed or being asleep. For example, some are reported to take place while driving a car. Sleep paralysis while driving a car is not likely to produce an abduction experience. It's more likely to produce a serious accident. If you look at the history of abductions over time, the earlier abduction reports were described as taking place in bedrooms only about 1/4 of the time. So while bedroom abduction reports are much more common today, historically, looking at the entire collection of abduction reports, sleep paralysis, even if it is an accurate explanation in some cases, literally cannot explain all cases.
Right.
In fact, cannot explain most. Another explanation is that the experiences of abductions are brought about by the false memory-inducing effects of hypnosis. And hypnosis is widely used by investigators to study claims of abduction. problem with that is that, again, only about half of all reported abduction cases have used hypnosis at all. And even where hypnosis is used, it's generally used to help clarify memories that occurred prior to the hypnosis. So there, too, you have an explanation that may account for some aspects of the phenomenon, but it would be hard to understand how it could really account for the whole phenomenon itself. Well, Eddie Bullard has talked about psychic abductions, and what he means by that is abductions which do not seem to involve an actual physical removal of the abductee from the location where the abduction is taking place. Whether this is purely a psychological phenomenon, or as some might argue, the abduction is really taking place, but it's taking place on a mental level, and there's no need to abduct the body. You could essentially abduct the mind. Well, that's nothing we could really answer, but those are some of the ideas that are out there. I think from a research point of view, there is a problem with the increasing familiarity with the abduction tale. I prefer really to look at the earlier studies before the nature of abduction reports became as well known as they are now. I think it is very hard to separate what is a spontaneous experience or report, putting aside the issue of whether the reports are accurate or not. But it's very hard to put aside what would be a spontaneous report and one that has been extremely influenced by culture. And I think that as more and more attention is paid to these, as more and more media exposure exists, it's harder and harder to do that experimentally, and that really does interfere with things as a scientific question. And we do see some real changes. The prevalence of bedroom abduction reports is increasing dramatically, and I think that is largely becoming the stereotypical report that we see in the media as well. But again, if you go back 10, 20 years, that wasn't the typical report. So I think to some extent, the older reports might be more reliable as data, if you will, or as describing a kind of spontaneous experience than contemporary reports. Obviously, another alternative point of view is that the nature of the events are really changing, but it becomes more difficult to make that kind of a determination. I prefer to stick with the data, and I think the data now still have far too many questions and not enough answers. My guess is that many of the explanations that we talked about apply in some cases, and the real interesting question for me is, once you've exhausted those explanations, what might account for the others? And I'm not sure. If it's a psychological phenomenon, it remains a very interesting psychological phenomenon. It really doesn't conform to typical phenomena. And of course, if it's not a psychological phenomenon, then it's even more interesting, perhaps.
But I would like to see the proof first, if you will, because it's so easy to find confirmatory cases or examples based on our own experiences, and to then become convinced that the absence of information is consistent with whatever theory we come up with. I think it makes a great story. I mean, the idea of there being a melding of two races, humans and extraterrestrials, to create a whole new species and a new era of understanding, supposedly, between ourselves and visitors, and a kind of ultimate joining and merger is a very interesting idea and kind of a wonderful thought. That's not to say that puts the stamp of truth onto it. Also, to be a part of that is an exciting idea. It's a fulfilling idea. It can lend meaning and purpose to a person's life. If you haven't done wonderful things or heroic things on this earth, why not on a spacecraft, even if you feel somewhat victimized by it?
From my perspective, you have to include both clinical psychology and transpersonal psychology to really understand it. So the clinical psychology is needed to deal with the traumatic aspects. And this is where the body holds the score. Okay, so you are going to have the emotional trauma that people experience. And you need clinical psychology to interpret and to treat that and to deal with that. And when you work through the trauma, then the spiritual aspect unfolds. So you've got the body, you've got the physical and emotional body that's participating now in the experience. And then you have to also look at it in terms of higher states of consciousness. Because some of these encounters are taking place where people are seemingly out of their body. Okay, so to have somebody that can tell the difference between that subtle realm, and by subtle realm I just mean, oh gosh, the unseen dimension that is all around us, the realm of angels and aliens, and
fairies and jinns.
Yes, exactly. So I'm just gonna, across the board, subtle realm, and probably in some more esoteric belief systems, the astral realm as well. Okay, so I'm just gonna lump that all together and say that across the board, you've got people having encounters where they're not necessarily in their physical body. Some are, I would say, and some aren't. So you've got to learn how to distinguish. You've got to learn how to tell the difference, and you've got to be able to encompass the spiritual experience or the spiritual interpretation, because that's where people finally start to integrate this experience. When you go into these experiences, that sense of who you are changes. It is shattered, and hence you have the possibility of expansion.
Would you say this is an experience that's been going on throughout human history, or is it a recent experience?
I think in some form it has, but I think there are important changes. Okay, so in that sense, I could say both. I think that our experience with higher realm beings and dimensions, it's recorded in the Vedic traditions, in the Hindu traditions.
And the Hebrew Bible?
And exactly. So you've got higher dimensional beings. You have that communication and that influence coming in, that impact on our evolution. However, now we're seeing things that I think are fairly new, and that may have to do with our the possible demise of our species. So that's the big thing with this phenomenon as well, is that people, experiencers, are very much being downloaded with information, if you will, or shown things about the environment and about our that we may not be here in the same form, even in our lifetime. Okay, and hence now there seems to be the process is being sped up, if you will. It's that it's being amplified, and so in this sense, I think that this is why the physical body is now so much a part of it.
Gordon Creighton, who an English academic, who was the editor of Flying Saucer Review, a great mind, a great man. He was the one who first presented the Jinn hypotheses to the UFO research field. Now, the Jinns, as described in the Muslim Quran, which is the Muslim Bible, are what they call a third order of creation. The Quran describes that the angels, the first order of creation, was created first, that the jinns, the second order of creation, was created second after the angels and was given the earth to live here. But that they were paraphysical, that they did not live in space-time as such in a physical space-time world, but in a dimension around our world. And then that the third order of creation was humankind, who was given the physicality of our earth to live on. But that the earth is to be shared by jinns and humans, and that jinns are good and evil, just like humans are, and just like angels are. That they're good and evil jinns, and that according to Gordon Creighton's hypothesis, that the so-called entities, the so-called UFO entities, who reportedly abduct human beings and sexually harass them and victimize them in other ways, are actually the order of creation which the Muslims call jinns, that they are a paraphysical form of creation, which shares the earth with us.
And they're appearing as flying saucer occupants?
Gordon Creighton explained very, very clearly that during the past millennia of human cultures, there have been types of sexually harassing creatures, paraphysical, which harass different cultures, but they appear in different shapes to each culture according to what the culture can accept. Their clothing, their mannerisms, their looks, according to what the culture can accept. And so I expanded on this, and I got the idea, speculation, that since the UFO, the physical UFO craft, started its new phase around 1947 in the United States, that the order of creation that the Muslims call jinns, that the Celtics call fairy folk, that the Europeans call incubi, and which other cultures all over the world, major and minor, call by different names, began to wonder how in the world could they appear to an American and frighten an American into submitting to their victimization, and that it might have taken them a while to figure out a way in which they could frighten Americans, but that eventually they thought, well, if they appeared to Americans in the form of technologically superior UFO entities from UFOs, that would frighten any American, you see. And that this is when this huge explosion of so-called abductions began, beginning in the 60s, but especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and continuing to this day. These creatures are deceptive. They are described as deceptive in the Quran. They are deceptive as incubi. They are deceptive as Celtic fairies, you see. So that is what I think.
Okay. Do you think that there's any possibility that any of the abductions are physical? Any of them, do you think? Well,
I would say that there is a possibility, possibly Travis Walton, possibly. Although the witnesses that saw the UFO strike him with his beam of light did not see him go into the UFO, you see. So it might have been an altered state, a scenario that Travis Walton experienced too. But I would leave it up to Travis Walton to to make his own decision. I would not want to, because I respect Travis too much.
Right.
And also, there are a few, maybe 2 or 3 other cases where it's possible. Betty and Barney Hill is a possibility because of the double witness there.
Okay.
But most abductions that I have investigated, and I've investigated about 300 cases all along, they all seem to me to be experienced in an altered state of reality, not dreaming, but an altered state in which these creatures can appear to human beings.
Now, there are fairy stories of mysterious lights. The trooping fairies often, they're just little twinkling lights all along the place. But
Tinkerbell.
Yeah, but lots of them.
Yeah.
And then you have the fairy when they have a party. They often live under mounds, prehistoric burial mound type things, according to stories. And these things will rise up on pillars of light. And the description is perfectly like a landed UFO. You'll even get some cases where they actually descend from the sky in a circle of light or something like that. So you get the UFO connection. But an even more trenchant parallel is the abduction phenomenology and the fairy phenomenology, where someone enters fairyland and there's a supernatural lapse of time. When you go into the fairies are often described as being diminutive supernatural beings. There again, a close parallel to the aliens. Sometimes fairies even have large eyes, so that's not a very common element. But fairyland is very similar to the inside of the spaceship insofar as it's a subterranean kind of place. You never see the sun, although there's a kind of uniform luminosity over the sky. That's also, if anyone is carried off to the alien other world, that's usually how it's described, that there's some sort of a uniform light or something kind of subterranean about it. It can often be very beautiful, or it can be very barren. And that also parallels the fairy otherworld, where under the influence of the fairies' glamours or mental influences, you see this luxurious place, and the fairies are rather beautiful people. But then if you can see, if that glamour collapses, then you see that it's a very mean, dirty, ugly, sparse environment, and the fairies themselves are scrawny and ugly. Then you have the element of the fairies stealing children. A very common element. The fairies are not reproductively self-sufficient. Neither are the aliens. They steal babies. They mate with mortals, sometimes by deception. And there are fairy offspring or hybrid offspring of fairies and humans that seem to have unusual powers. Parallel again to the alien hybrids of today. But you'll find that all along, that there are these similar ideas that have been with us from time immemorial, and they keep reappearing in various forms, updated a little bit, but essentially the same. And that's pretty much one way of looking at abductions.
First of all, I have trouble getting my arms around the imaginal realm. I understand it's sort of, half what we're used to, half something else, and has its counterpart in various religions and so forth and so on. But what's intriguing is that a lot of very distinguished scientists, physicists, physical scientists, are talking about, hidden levels of reality, multiple dimensions, things like that. And, is it something to be taken seriously? Is it a cop-out? I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the imaginal realm is evaluated 100 years from now.
They're inventing it, or it's happening. There isn't any other imaginal realm where something even more bizarre than the abduction phenomenon might be happening to people that we have evidence of. Let's put it that way.
I'm talking to him one day.
Yeah.
And we're talking about his experience. And he's telling me he was lifted out of the car, his parents' car. They're driving along the highway late at night, lifted up, going into the air, being taken up to a UFO. And I asked him the question, did you look down? And he said, yeah, I looked down. What did you see? He said, I saw the car. Who was in the car? Well, my parents and me in the back seat.
Mm-hmm.
That to me says imaginal realm.
No, it doesn't.
What do you mean? No, it doesn't.
It says confabulation. No. That doesn't say imaginal realm. You're believing him.
Well,
why would you believe him
this is
when he
his
says
experience.
that? No.
This is the experience he's reporting. You're denying him his
Yes.
experience.
That's what we learn to do. When they remember things at face value, the answer, when they remember things consciously and they tell you that, the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. Let's investigate it and see what really happens.
That's fair enough.
I have so much experience with this kind of thing that where I thought, oh, this is probably what happened. This sounds like, this sounds right. And then I do hypnosis and it's not what happens. And the person will immediately admit to me, this is not what I thought happened, but this really happened. I didn't see myself in the car.
But wait a second. This experience was not consciously remembered. This was a hypnosis.
Confabulation. Simple as that. These are these oddities that don't prove anything. They prove, the only thing they prove is that methodological questions must be asked right then and there. Well, you cannot instantly go to another realm of existence.
No, I agree.
You cannot do that.
I agree.
You're dealing with methodology first and foremost.
I agree. In terms of an absolutely scientific kind of a study, I absolutely agree.
That is the only way to go with this. As soon as you get away from scientific or systematic study, you start to float around and never land. It's a horrible mistake. The point is that this is either psychological or it's happening. Period. That is it. I hate to say that, but it is.
It's the psychological is just too limiting.
No,
listen.
I'm using it in every sense. I don't care what sense you use it in, but it is not happening in objective reality. It is happening in the person's. There is nothing.
What consensus reality that we can all agree on sitting here right now in this room? This is event level reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right, and it is not happening in this reality.
Yeah.
And I haven't found other realities. And the point I'm saying that is that with over 1,000 sessions I've had with people now, and with God knows how many sessions Bud has had, maybe 1,500 or so, or 2,000, we have not found that imaginal level. That has not shown up as a significant force in this phenomenon, and it would.
How would you look for it?
It would just show up that they could in fact see themselves, and they could describe this, and they could do that, and there would be other aspects to it that we continually get this. Eventually, it would force us to move to say there's another level of reality happening here we hadn't understood, and now it's beginning to develop in before us. We're beginning to understand that it's undressing itself in front of us, so to speak. That has not happened. We've been doing this for a long time now. And we've had a lot of sessions with a lot of people. This has not happened. And when you point to one person here, one person there, one person here, it doesn't mean anything. It's totally meaningless. It's totally meaningless because it doesn't make a pattern. We don't have that pattern. The patterns are not there. And when we think the patterns are there, they dissolve with correct methodology. And we know that we're asking the right questions now because the person will say, wait a second, I don't think this happened the way I thought it did. Then you know you're on the right track.
At one point, in trying to find more information about what these experiences were, I had two ambitions. One was to be able to remain calm enough so that if an experience occurred again, I would be able to remain calm enough to interact with these beings and learn directly from them what was going on. I managed to at least keep my heart rate down. When an experience would start, I would no longer, be racing. But I never really developed the sort of calmness which would let me interact. Additionally, it seems like when I'm in their environment, I'm a little bit out of it. Everything is a little bit slurred. I'm not able to interact, and I don't know if they drug me or something in order to keep me relatively harmless, or what. But I was never quite able to establish a level of conscious communication with them. So I tried a different way of hopefully getting some information. I tried meditating, and in this meditation, I tried to sort of communicate with these beings because I knew they were telepathic. And so, okay, granted, they weren't in my environment at the moment, but I thought perhaps I have some kind of communication, perhaps I can get some information. So I entered a nice meditation, and sure enough, I got this sort of mythic story, which to me was explanations of why they were interacting with us, what this whole reproductive experience was. And I don't know if this was like a literal history or if it was simply a mythic history, just as our mythic stories of the Greek gods fulfilled different aspects. The gods exemplified different elements of our personalities and explained behaviors.
Right.
So this might simply be more of the psychology of the Greys as opposed to an actual history. But the sense that I got was that the beings had lost a world, either through something like the atmosphere just rippling away, some sort of disaster had turned their world into a desert. And I got this sense of profound guilt from them, that they felt that this was such a sacrilege, that they felt that they could never again connect with God, almost like they had been cast out. This is very theological concepts coming from a person like myself who was raised without any religion whatsoever, post-religious community. But the sense was that they felt that they could never be forgiven for having lost a world, which to me explained two things. It explained, in one sense, the environmental sort of messages which they're now conveying to us, saying, look, our world is threatened too. Be careful. This is a very precious world. But beyond that, it also accounted for why they were seemingly interested in our biology, interested in creating a generation which was part alien and part human, which had elements of both of our species. To me, it wasn't simply that they had found a biological compatibility, because apparently from all the scientific intervention they've had to do in order to make this even possible, it doesn't seem like a perfect fit. Skeptics often scoff, oh, human beings could never breed with another species. It just wouldn't be possible. Well, it's not very straightforward. It seems to have been like a 50-year project to make that possible. But I felt that they weren't simply trying to enrich their DNA or any sort of those classical current science cliches of what aliens would be doing. To me, they wanted a generation which, like humanity, had the potential to connect to spirit. And my sense is that in the repeated abductions throughout my life and throughout other people's lives, they were studying the way that we start out very isolated. We're born and we don't have really any sense of connection to anyone except our parents. But some of us evolve into a kind of communication with spirit. I don't want to define it in terms of religion or anything. Sure. But eventually, people tend to develop or cultivate a sort of relationship with spirituality in one form or another. And I think that is what they are interested in. And I think that sometimes when they're examining our bodies, they are studying the growth of our spiritual being. And that when they're interbreeding with us, they're trying to create a species which has the potential to reconnect to spirit, a connection which they feel was broken when they lost an entire planet. And
so this is much about their reintegration with spirit as ours.
I think it is. I think it is truly an effort for them to regain an element of humanity, which certainly humanity has always valued. Our spiritual connection, which gives birth to our sense of empathy, our sense of responsibility. All these things which matter very deeply. I think that's what attracts them to us. And this might sound like a really far-fetched theory, but I think that I think that if that's true, it's a purpose that you could understand the importance of, that it's not something that they could simply ask for. I mean, they feel the responsibility of saving their entire race. Now, if that's going to involve occasionally terrorizing people accidentally, I think that's a risk that they're going to take. But I think also on a slightly more, slightly larger perspective, I think that their initial belief that they have lost this connection, I think it's misfounded. I think that they have such incredibly long lifespans that the beings we're dealing with now are probably only like 2 or 3 generations removed from whatever disaster they're speaking of. And I think that actually, if they would come into open contact with us, I think we could actually forgive them for whatever sin they feel that they've done. But I don't know. Again, I don't know if this is simply just a sort of story which fulfills what they're doing, or if it's an actual history. I don't know. What I do know is I do feel some sympathy for these beings. I think that the sort of responsibility that we have as a species to other life is a responsibility which we shouldn't ignore, even if the beings were evil beings. I think I mentioned this earlier. Some people are, quite of the opinion that any beings who would do these horrible things must be evil. Even if they were, I think we have a responsibility to help other life and perhaps influence them. And if we are sharing an element of humanity with them as they form a new generation, then I think surely some of our qualities will express themselves in their species.
Are you of the opinion that there is a crossover into the physical?
Yeah, I am, and here's why. I was kind of like John Mack. I myself was really emphasizing the idea that these beings were somehow coming from the world which we had dubbed the spiritual world. Probably an inaccurate term, just a term from our history, the spiritual realm.
Do you prefer another term?
No, I think it works as long as people can appreciate the concept of spiritual without automatically thinking of religion. Even if we're talking about other dimensions, as physicists might prefer to call these, perhaps these are other realities. We'll come up with the language for that eventually. Spiritual seems right because the experience of being brought into the alien environment, being passed from one reality to another, it seems revelatory enough that the word spiritual sort of does feel correct. The only distinction is that to say that these alien beings might emerge from or travel through the spiritual realm doesn't automatically mean that they are any more spiritual beings any more than we are. Okay, I'm not saying they're angels. So as long as that distinction is appreciated, spiritual works just fine. Yeah.
And the crossover?
The crossover, for me, I can't deny the fact that there doesn't seem to be any physical evidence left behind. And so for the longest time, I felt that these experiences might be almost entirely spiritual. But my last experience that I ever had to date was about 3 years ago. So it was in November of 2003. And I was sleeping in my 3rd floor apartment, and I woke up. I was sleeping on my stomach, on my chest. And I woke up, and I opened my eyes, and this being was just receding away from my face. One of the small little gray beings. And it was almost like it had sort of nudged me awake, except instead of flicking me awake, I think it had just sort of like mentally said, "Wake up." And I opened my eyes, and I see this being and a larger being next to it, kind of like security, to the side. And I've had enough experiences at this point so that my heart, it's not going to race. And in fact, at this point, I just opened my eyes and I was like, not in the mood for this. I'm going to go back to sleep. Forget it. Shut my eyes, and it takes my hands, and it squeezes my hands very, very physically hard, as if to say, we are physical, we're here, we're real. You can close your eyes, but you can't deny that this is a real experience. And then to sort of, again, the theatric quality of their interactions, just touching one's hands is a theatrical gesture. And then, even though they normally speak telepathically, this one did something, again, simply to restate the fact that it was materially real, in that it actually used its throat and mouth to speak. And this raspy voice comes out, and it's telling me certain things. And it's actually using a combination of mental images and vocalizations. But what I took away from that night was a sort of reminder that as many spiritual properties as these beings seem to have, that their ability to sort of defy the material world, the way that time seems to carry on at a different pace when they're around, all these elements which seem so dissimilar from our normal waking reality, despite those differences, I think they were sort of there to remind me that yes, but beyond it all, they are physically real, or at least they're real with a capital R. You can't deny that they're not some intangible spiritual entity.
Or some projection of the unconscious or anything like that.
No, the whole Jungian thing, I don't think that they're an expression of humanity, unless perhaps in some strange convoluted way they are our descendants coming back in time, or some convoluted way. No, they are kin to us. They're related to us in the sense that everything originally, formed from one point. Everything from that point is related. But we seem to live in slightly different worlds. And so spiritual, but spiritual not quite the right word.
Yeah.
Interdimensional, maybe not quite the right word. And I think there's another reason why you haven't seen another advancement beyond the work that was recent, is I don't think people are having alien encounter experiences anymore, at least not in the same way that they were. My circle of friends who I met through John Mack's organization, none of us have reported many experiences over the last 3 or 4 years. Whitley Strieber, writing on his website, said that around 2000, 2001, all of the reports which he had been receiving many letters from suddenly dried up. This experience seems to have actively changed or moved away, which you wouldn't expect if this was a purely psychological phenomenon. You'd expect people of different ages would continue to be having experiences. They seem very infrequent now. And perhaps it's because the aliens have finally learned a different way to communicate with us, that this effort to mix these two different species may have finally been perfected. Because if you read some of the earlier accounts, people were describing being presented with very sickly children, beings which were part alien and part human, but seemed very ill. And perhaps they finally managed to solve the technological problem of mixing these species.
Which brings us to The Threat. Have you read it?
I did leaf through The Threat in a bookstore once, yes. I couldn't see buying it.
Basically what David is saying is what you're saying. They've perfected it, and they're intermingling with it, with us, and his concern, the threat.
That it's an invasion.
It's an invasion.
Well, as a historian, he would have that perspective of nation conquering nation. But if you say that there was an evolution of beings who were going to live upon this world, that shouldn't really be too threatening if you believe in the concept of incarnation, of being born into different life forms. Well, who's to say at the end of our 100 years, we aren't born and we won't exist as part alien, part human being? Why should that be so frightening? It would only be terrifying if they were, taking over our world, which they do not seem to be doing, obviously. So that sort of paranoia is understandable from the perspective of a historian who sees nation conquering nation, but it isn't what we're seeing here. It's not something I worry about. I think that, if anything, we're looking at a partnership between two species. Perhaps humankind will eventually pass away, as our ancestor species did, as Cro-Magnon man did, and eventually we will tail out. There's nothing wrong with that. It's what would be really incredible, though, is to be alive in the time when the different species are overlapping. I mean, just to be able to share that kind of different perspective on life will be absolutely amazing.
Maybe that's the time we are living in.
I don't think we're there yet, because so far all we have is these little hints, these little bits of memory which people experience. We don't have enough. I mean, I know I've been with them for more than 5 minutes at a time. I want to know where I was living my life during those hours. I feel I've earned it. After going through these experiences, I want to be able to have an equal exchange with these beings. And, as I grow older, I don't know if that will happen. If it never happens, I'll be disappointed, because I want to know if I have offspring in this world, beings I've met. One of the beings I met as a child, I haven't seen her in years, and I think that maybe she was elderly and she died. Shouldn't I be able to know that for a fact or not? It's, I don't know.
Will you be able to live with it if you don't know?
I think that even if they never show up in our world, sort of informed by my new sense of spirituality, which arose out of these experiences, my belief in incarnation, my belief that the soul continues, that the soul started at the Big Bang and carries through to present day, I have to imagine on my deathbed, as I am disappearing into the other worlds, I will probably understand who these beings were. And I think that will be satisfying enough. I think that would be good enough, but I would like it to happen while I'm still alive. We're witnessing something that's taking thousands of years. It's not just 50 years of alien encounters. We're seeing a species that's probably thousands of years old, a species that came from another planet at some time. Maybe they evolved and grew into a different plane of reality, and now they're interacting with ours. This is a long duration event. We're witnessing this small part of it, and we have this opportunity to grasp it as real. And yet we have skeptics. We have these nattering nabobs in our society who are saying, no, it's nothing, ignore it. And if we do, we would be the greatest fools ever, because even if we don't have the language for it, even if we can't quite grasp what these experiences are yet, we're seeing part of it. And we can't deny that we're seeing part of it, because it is such a magnificent, grand part of the universe's history that we're experiencing, if we would only look at it closer.